think we have to be prepared. Wait for it, Doug. I'm going to get spicy. Our lead pastor says it this way: to disappoint people at a rate that they can tolerate. Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. We are in season 4 of this podcast, and this season we're really talking about helping us prepare for whatever the next push might be, whether we're heading into fall or heading into spring or heading into the holiday season, whatever it might be, helping church leaders prepare for the next push and to be really intentional about our planning and strategy around that push. And I'm here, as usual, with my good friend Doug Parks. Doug, what's up?
Erin, a lot. What's up with you?
A lot as well, Doug. Always a lot. There's always something going on. It just seems like, there's never a dull moment these days,
Ever. It's just
ever.
Different ranges of speed is what it feels like.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I'm sure our listeners can agree with that. Let's all just take a collective deep breath that it just seems like there is always at least 10 plates spinning at any given moment. So the funny thing about this episode is oftentimes Doug and I have a guest. We don't have any other guests today. It's just Doug and I. And I was just informed that Doug is interviewing me for this podcast. So that just got flipped on me literally about 3 minutes ago. So Doug, I guess take it away.
Oh, thank you for the intro, Erin. And I normally would start with give us a little background on you, but hopefully our listeners have been tuning in for a while and know who you are. But we've been addressing this theme this season. We're going to address even more of it, of preparing for the next season of ministry and how are we going to push in this next season, and what are the things we're going to prioritize and emphasize. So today's conversation, I wanted to really hone in on what I believe a lot right now. We're in a moment of evolution in church leadership where the way in which we're going to lead the church going forward has to be very different. And I do think when history looks back at this time, COVID will be the lever that really differentiated it, but it was already headed there. And a lot of it was a generational shift. There appears to be, sociologists are studying a pretty definitive shift in mindset, thinking, approach to the world, worldview, really between my generation, Generation X, and definitely the boomer generation, who I've had the privilege of serving alongside for years, some awesome church leaders, and the millennial and Gen Z generations. And so I just wanted to first start out with, okay, Erin, you're a millennial, right?
What? Yes, Yes, sir, I am.
So I want to get your take on history of kind of what we call in church as an intentional church is Piston 2. It's the life-changing relationships model. And a lot of churches have different models, whether it's Sunday school, life group, small group, ABS, missional communities, house church. Everybody's got a new term to reterm or whatever and try to make it look different. But I wanted to get your take as a millennial leader on the recent history of the pros and cons of the small group models that you've kind of grown up in ministry watching succeed or fail to some level. So do you have some take on the pros and cons and how you would describe kind of this last season of group ministry, if you will?
Sure. Yeah. I'll give you a little bit of background of like what I've witnessed in my lifetime, because I am a millennial. So I'm a 90s kid. So I grew up in Awanas memorizing Bible verses. That was like my childhood, quote unquote, life-changing relationships.
Store?
Oh my goodness. Awanas. And I just remember we had these painted colored benches. And for all of our listeners, if you grew up in church, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because I feel like every church in America had these same painted benches that you sat on and memorized your Bible verses in Awanas. Then I grew up, I was a youth group kid. I was in a small group with girls, my age group. That was kind of the small group model then. Then I became an intern and I was a student pastor. And so I did small group ministry in a youth group setting. And then now, am working more across the church and have seen a real shift in how we approach life-changing relationships, but really primarily small groups. And one of the things I think that I've noticed and observed is, for a long time, my experience of and what I witnessed was that small groups really were, at least in my context, they were kind of your church friends. And there was really no crossover between your church friends and then all the other friends that you had, and outside of church. And there was really no emphasis on inviting in or making space for the people that were close to those group members but far from God. And so my experience of that personally in a small group was my small group, while meaningful and while I loved and appreciated those people, it felt very disconnected from the rest of my life. Now, my experience is a little bit different because I've been in ministry, but I observed that in my friends who, worked in, secular marketplace, and it was like their small group just felt very connected from the rest of their life. There was lacking integration. It was like, this is my church activity, and then I go and do the rest of my life activity. And so that's what I would say is one of the cons is that piece of it. And then also, I would say we, over time, I'm speaking in generalities here. So for our listeners, if this is not your experience, that's great. But I feel like many times we have just kind of created community for people rather than inviting them to help shape and form that community. And we have relied on the leader of said community to determine the path for that community, rather than every person in the community has a seat at the table to influence and bring a contribution and all those things to the community in a particular direction. And so I even think about groups that I've been in that maybe have been not the healthiest that they could have been, or just not growing and thriving in ways they could have been. As a group participant, that wasn't really up to me. It was really up to the group leader. And I just think that all of that is shifting and changing away from even, we don't want to admit it, but we've even had hierarchy in our life-changing relationships. And I just think we're getting away from some of that. I don't know. I'm talking for a long time, Doug. I don't even know if I'm answering your question at this point.
Oh, you are for sure. And I don't want to be, Gen Xers can be a bit cynical and deconstructionist. So I don't want to go too far down the negative road, but I want to talk a little more about the con you mentioned, the disconnection from real life that you saw at a very young age in this delivery mechanism or strategy of the church. And what do you think have been some of the unintended consequences of that approach, that we're in essence creating a carve out of life that is, I don't know how I put words around it, but the kind of the way I heard you describe it was, this is a bubble. We created a little bubble that's not real life, and it's not, maybe not even, I'll let you answer the question. Like, what do you think were the unintended consequences of this approach that many of us as church leaders are still using?
Yeah. I think our people don't know how to experience the Great Commission because our church time is carved out as our church time, and then our everything else time is our everything else time. And there's no integration in our lives between how we show up in a church environment and how we show up outside of a church environment. And so I always think about the Great Commission, go and make disciples. But if you really look at the translation, it's like, as you are going, as you're going about your day, as you're going about your work, as you're going about your life, make disciples. And so when we segment off part of our life for our church activity, we're not really living the as you're going part. We're doing the I'm gonna deepen my faith here, but then that has no connection to the rest of my life. And so I think because of that, we live in a church culture where even for our 99, even for the congregants, they don't know how to bring together their faith with the rest of their life. That's a real point of tension that I hear from people all the time. Like, how would I even begin to engage in a spiritual conversation? Or how would I even begin to, ask my friend what they think about these things, because we have lived so separated and not integrated with these things.
It makes me wonder, as you're talking about, there's so much turbulence, I'll use that word, in church leader world around what was the seeker movement or the seeker sensitive movement. and that we look back and we go, oh, that's what created consumeristic culture in our churches. And yeah, I agree to some degree, yes, where it was taken too far and it was about, providing something that people liked, that in its very nature is consumeristic in its thinking. However, when I hear you talking, it feels like this morning, even I did some work at a coffee shop here locally, and it was both beautiful and a smidge alarming. There were 16 to 20 younger girls paired up or in threes doing Bible studies very publicly in a coffee shop. Awesome. But my mind couldn't help but go to the drift to what you just said. Were they doing this as they were going, as they were living out the Great Commission? Or were they actually being just consumers of Scripture for a personal reason? And I'm not, I don't know them. I'm not, I'm just saying my mind was in both places. I'm like, well, this is awesome. They're here and not in a church building. There's a tattoo shop sitting right in the coffee shop. So I'm like, there's no fault here. But it does make me go, this consumeristic culture that a lot of church leaders like to talk about, how far reaching is it in our mindsets, even in things like the way we've designed our groups ministry? Yeah. So, I want to transition and ask you about then, okay, if this is your assessment and, hopefully I'm praying you're going to be leading in the church for 20, 30, whatever years, and you're going to transition to a different generation of leadership eventually. How are you beginning to think about a traditional Sunday school class or small group or whatever your model is differently? Give us some bullets, like a few things, like you used to think about it this way. Now we're thinking about it this way.
Yeah, for sure. The first thing I would say is, and you just alluded to it, but I'm sure all of our listeners can relate to this question that you receive. And I've mentioned this on previous podcasts before. When someone shows up to your church on a Sunday morning and says, what do you have for fill in the blank? For young adults, for men, for women, for older folks, for young adults, for whatever it is. What do you have for? And I think our answer to that question, we as church leaders have felt like we have to have an answer. And if we don't have an answer for any one of those questions that's coming, we have failed, or we have not met people in what they need or what they expect or what they hope. And so I think as we think about the future of some of this, even like our life-changing relationships and, small group ministry and things like that, I think we have to be prepared. Wait for it, Doug. I'm going to get spicy. Our lead pastor says it this way: to disappoint people at a rate that they can tolerate. And that does not mean causing harm on purpose. That is not malicious, but disappointing people at a rate they can tolerate. Meaning, we do not have to have an answer for every single person who comes and says, what do you have for? And I think the way of the future is inviting every person who shows up asking for that or asking for anything to try to get to the bottom of, what does this person bring to the table? Because where we have honestly, like, I feel like where we're experiencing some of the downsides of some of what we've done is this church staff has tried to be the answer for everything. And we've tried to have a place for everybody, and we've tried to find everybody's people for them. And that has led us to, that's one factor, to some consumerism and to people not being equipped to live their faith in their everyday life. And so I think if we want to shift that, we have to be willing to offer simple tools and simple training at the drop of a hat, so that the average Joe that walks up, or the average Jill that walks up to your welcome center or your info booth or whatever you call that, your version of that on a weekend, and says, what do you have for blank? That we can use that as a moment for equipping and training that person to reach the people that are close to them but far from God. That's a totally different conversation than, let me just plug you into a group that already exists and we'll find your people for you. But really putting ownership back on that person to say, we will partner with you, we will go with you, but we're not going to do this for you. And so our job here, we see ourselves as like a collector of people and a training ground to send you back out. And so I think there's some mindset shift that has to happen. And so, for example, in small group world, when someone comes to us and says, I want to be in a group, our first question to that person is, well, do you have people in your life already that you could start a group with? Rather than let's put you in a group. And let me just say, we do have groups that are open. And for the person that's just moved here or doesn't know anybody or anything like that, we will help someone find a group. We're not just going to be mean about it and say, sorry, that's on you. You know, you don't have relationships. We do believe that the church has a responsibility, but that's not what we lead with. We don't lead with, sure, let me find you a group. We lead with who's close to you but far from God that we could help you start a group with. Do you already have a couple followers of Jesus that might meet with you, and then a couple people that aren't followers of Jesus, and we could train you on how to do this? We will be here for you. We'll coach you every step of the way, and have that conversation first to open their mind and to be thinking about, oh my goodness, I could have this in my normal everyday life at work or whatever. It doesn't need to be a church program or function that I come to. And then, so it's just all about the order of the questions that you ask is one of the things I would say about that, Doug.
That's great. It's great, Erin. And I think I want to go back and unpack that phrase. It's just so rich for church leaders. You know, we as church leaders, so many of us get into ministry because we want to serve people. We want to help them. And so when they ask for something, we want to serve them and supply it. So having the response is we want to disappoint them at say it again, disappoint them at a tolerance level
they can tolerate. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder if you just a little more unpacking that, if you could share with the listeners about maybe a story where that went really well, and then maybe where it didn't go so well. But you may not be able to come up with both. But I'm just wondering, just to kind of play it out a little bit, give it a little more color to it.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think that on the good side, we've had some encounters like that where people have come in and said, oh my goodness, do you do, you know, a question we get all the time is, what kind of men's gatherings do you have? Do you guys meet on Saturday mornings for men's gatherings or whatever? And it's like, no, we don't do that, you know? And I remember someone saying, so you don't care about men? It's like,
yes.
Well, that's also not true at all. We care deeply about everybody finding Jesus. And so I would say some people don't want to hear what you have to say next. And so I can think of a few encounters of our poor volunteers in our info center trying to engage people on a Sunday. And we've trained them to say, no, we don't have those things, but this is what we can do or what we're willing to do, you know? And so many stories of that just not going well for people, and them assuming that, oh, well, then you just don't care about fill in the blank, whatever group of people that I just asked what you have for. I would say on the flip side of that, though, we've started, I mean, every month we start multiple groups that don't come through a program here, that come from someone showing up in our info center and asking, do you have a group at this date and this time? And us saying, actually, we don't, but we'd love to help you start that group. And we'd love to help train you and equip you to be able to do what you need to do to start that group. And so every month we have at least a couple groups that are started that way, because people are met with, no, we don't have exactly what you're looking for, but we can help you be the answer you're looking for and invite others into the good that God's going to bring through you. So,
well, I love that approach, in that, because I'm going to guess that a lot of people good-heartedly will lean in if you bring them help and
absolutely
they'll be a part of that solution instead of, and you know, the thing about it is that there's not only and let's be clear, who's coming up to your welcome center or whatever your version of connection is and asking that question is a churched person. We're not,
right.
A one is not coming up and saying, do you have a men's thing on Saturday morning? Somebody 100%. Who doesn't know Jesus yet or is brand new to Jesus. And so, you know, I love the tactic that we're actually going to challenge growth in that Christian to go and activate instead of just consume, you know, whatever we deliver.
And you know, Doug, what's really interesting about that is, in my experience, which I acknowledge is limited because I'm only a millennial, Doug.
Not only.
Yeah, right. I am a millennial. Is church people are the ones that are often more resistant to having ownership and doing something about what the problem that they see or the thing they're asking. The people far from God who are just showing up here, they're kind of like, okay, sure, I'll do that. If that's what you say is the next best thing to do, I'm all in. Like, they don't have a lens of consuming as much as longtime church people. And so this shift for us, this mindset shift, has been actually way harder with our churched people than with those who are just exploring faith.
Isn't that funny? Yeah, it's so funny. And again, we've talked about this before on the podcast. What I hear you describe is you're emulating what Jesus did in the Bible. He was teaching as they were doing, not just teaching in a consumptive manner. It's just fascinating to me that we've gotten here where it's actually easier to get a one to do what we think they should do spiritually. I'm not talking about just what we want as the organization spiritually, than it is a lot of long-term believers. Okay, so this season we're really pushing into this. Hey, what are you doing to get ready? How are you thinking about this next season? And so I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. In your leadership, as you're thinking about this next seasonal push upcoming, what are the things that are becoming a priority? What are the projects or the emphases that around this idea of community and life-changing relationships? Like, what are you thinking about? Hey, we're really going to go after this in the coming months to take the next steps forward. Because we all know, all of us as church leaders know, church leadership is a long-haul journey. Somehow all of us been tricked in this silver bullet mentality where we like fast results but this design, I just want to use the word prioritizing and sequencing. That's what we try to teach in intentional churches is we have to, as a ministry leader, have the long view around all of our strategies, but especially around groups and community. And so then if I back up into the question, then for this next season, what are you prioritizing and sequencing as next as you have that long view of the journey in play?
Absolutely. That's a good question. It's no secret that this next season holds the election.
Oh.
And so, sorry to bring up a buzzword, but it's just a reality. Yeah. And so you think about life-changing relationships are going to never be more important than in this next season. And so we just actually had a strategy day recently, and we said, everything we do in this next season needs to be marked by knitting relational fabric together. So if it does not create space for people to engage deeply with one another, we're not doing it. Because everything has to be about life-changing relationship. Is that very thing. And bringing people together who in no other place, in no other way, for no other reason would come together. But that is one of the assets of the church, is that we can bring people together that would never find each other any other way. And so that's our focus. And so we're going to be simple. We are not going to offer 100 different things. We are going to be simple, and we are going to run the play, and we are going to run it all through the lens of relationship. And so one of the things that we had talked about at the Intentional Churches Conference, which was just so helpful, is I think that as church leaders, oftentimes we feel like, well, we got into this for people, and people are the most important thing. So everything we do needs to have a relational component, which, yes, it should. And so we carve out relational time, quote unquote. One of the things we're trying to figure out is, how do we just do everything we do relationally? So that doesn't mean that we need to spend 30 minutes having a get to know you time, because honestly, that's every introvert's worst nightmare at a gathering or a training or whatever, right?
Amen.
But how does everything we do, we just do it relationally? So if we're going to train new group leaders, how do we do that relationally? If we're going to have even a night of worship, which for many churches is a big night of gathering all your people, how is that not just people standing and singing, yes, in a big room together, but individually, but how do we do that relationally? And so as we think about this next season, it's time to take another swing at growing the relational fabric of our church and our congregants' relationships with with the people close to them but far from God. And so we just want to continue to take another step at that. And so our long view, like you talked about, Doug, is to spark a movement of disciple makers with too many generations to count. And so this fall, taking another step and every person in our church growing and deepening a relationship that they might have in the church and those they have outside the church is just helping us in that direction.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to this at the end because we always like to do a pragmatic, practical tool. I want to come back to, are there, like you mentioned, the night of worship or maybe something else? Are there really pragmatic ideas that you guys are having now about how you're going to do that in this next season? But before we go there, one last topic I wanted to hit, and that was, I've come to believe that whatever your model is, the most important part to get the outcome you want, the scriptural outcome of, the Great Commission being fueled inside of community, inside of our life-changing relationships, the one another's of Scripture, if you will, the main relational disciple-making vehicle that we have. It all really comes down to the intent and heart and motive of the leader. And so I just wanted you to talk for a minute. First, do you agree or disagree with that? I don't want to just walk on like I'm going to assume that you agree with me.
Yeah, I think I'm tracking. I think I agree. Ask me your next question, and then I'll tell you if I still agree.
Okay, so if that's the case, then how are you thinking about equipping, training leaders with great coaching and coaching tools around them? Like, how are you thinking about that right now? If the outcome we want is in our life-changing relationships, really creating disciple makers, then how are you training, equipping, and deploying leadership and coaching? How are you thinking about that for the next season?
I'll be honest with you and say that ongoing coaching is probably the thing that is like our biggest growth edge right now, like trying to figure out how to do that at scale. So if any of our listeners have any great ideas about that, I'm all ears. But I think some of the shifts, like let's just talk just about small group leadership for a minute, just to kind of keep it centralized in one place. Taking the pressure off. So we've even changed our language of like from small group leader to small group facilitator so that it feels more inclusive and like everybody can do this. Anybody can do this. You don't need to have some Bible degree to be able to do this. You're just facilitating a conversation. And then every person that's going to facilitate a group comes through a basic class with just some basic disciple making tools handed to them. So we're trying to center it not in biblical knowledge, which is important, and we're not saying it's not important. But if the leader has a basic toolkit for disciple making, and that's the lens through which they're looking at their group, as this is a step in disciple making. This isn't intended to be the community that's going to last you the next 20 years. If it does, that's awesome. That's not our number one target. Our number one target is a place for people to discover more about God and to become disciple makers. And so getting that message and being very clear, the way we say it is like beginning with the end in mind. And so when we are inviting leadership at any level, small group leadership or anything, like making sure our invite to that person, our ask of that person is clear, and that we're beginning with the end in mind so that they have a vision of where we're going. So we do some trainings. We try to keep those very, very chill. We'll do some pop-up coaching. So like, hey, we'll send an email. Hey, if you're looking for if you feel stuck or you're looking for a simple next step for your group, pop by our info center this Sunday and someone will be available to talk to you in this 2-hour window. And people just show up and we just do pop-up coaching. It's not a big program. It's just
that's great.
Life on life, person on person, just available to have a 10 to 15 minute conversation. We have found that, finding people when they're already on our campus is really helpful. So we're experimenting and piloting with all sorts of different things of how that looks. But I would say beginning with the end in mind, helping people know that any leadership you take in our church is in the direction of helping people become disciple makers. And if the leader doesn't do that, then that's a real hindrance.
Do people show up at the pop-up things? Pop-up coaching?
Sometimes, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. We need to get more repetition with it. But we've definitely had a few people show up and say, help me navigate this thing or whatever. So.
That's great. So I just, and in closing, I want to come back to the practicality. So you talked about weaving the relational fabric, especially through the fall, the election. You even gave we're starting to think about the worship night differently that we're going to do this fall. Do you guys have any ideas coming to the surface about practically how you're going to weave that relational fabric better or differently this fall?
Yeah, I think a few ideas come to mind. First is what I already talked about. Any gatherings we're going to do with our church, a night of worship, a night of prayer, using those as key relational moments in our church. The other, as I would say, is how are we encouraging people to linger a little bit longer in our Sunday services, our weekend services? How are we creating, you talk about like relational speed bumps so that people actually want to stay and hang out and form relationship and have deeper conversations. Really, we're gonna focus in on helping people find their people this fall, and so some groups connection events, not where we find people's groups for them, but where we help them find their people. That language is very intentional right there, and so some opportunity, like everything we do, we're just going to basically be telling people don't go alone. So there's a few ways you don't go alone. You can join a group, you can join a team. We view our teams, our serving teams, as another place for people to be trained as disciple makers and to form great relationships with others. And then every event that we do, which we don't do a lot of events, but everything we do is going to have like this lens of weaving the relational fabric together. So
that's great, Erin. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation and interviewing you. So I'm going to punt it back to you to close us out, as I'm a novice at this.
Perfect. Great. Well, yeah, to our listeners, thanks so much for jumping in and for humoring us kind of flipping the tables on this conversation today. My encouragement to you would be to just spend some time reflecting. How are you thinking about some of the shifts that we talked about? How are you talking to the different age groups of the people on your staff and in your congregation to ask, what are they seeing is most helpful, or what is their experience growing up in church, and how are they seeing kind of even the present or the future of life-changing relationships? Just doing some survey work like that, I think will reveal a lot, because even Doug, your experience and my experience are very different. And someone in Gen Z's experience would be very different than mine. And so that would be my challenge to you, especially as you think about planning the next season. Do you have like diverse opinions and perspectives helping you plan and think? And how are you really thinking and planning well for life-changing relationships? So thanks so much for jumping into the podcast with us. We will see you soon.